Marigolds by Eugenia Collier. When I think of the hometown of my youth, all that I seem to remember is dust, the brown, crumbly dust of late summer, arid, sterile dust that gets into the eyes and makes them water, gets into the throat and between the toes of bare brown feet. I don't know why I should remember only the dust. Surely there must have been lush green lawns and paved streets under leafy shade trees somewhere in town. But memory is an abstract painting. It does not present things as they are, but rather as they feel. And so when I think of that time and that place, I remember only the dry September of the dirt roads and grassless yards of the shanty town where I lived. And one other thing I remember, another incongruence of memory, a brilliant splash of sunny yellow against the dust, Miss Lottie's marigolds. Whenever the memory of those marigolds flashes across my mind, a strange nostalgia comes with it and remains long after the picture has faded. I feel again the chaotic emotions of adolescence, elusive as smoke, yet as real as the potted geranium before me now. Joy and rage and wild animal gladness and shame become tangled together in the multicolored skin of 14 going on 15, as I recall that devastating moment when I was suddenly more woman than child, years ago in Miss Lottie's yard. I think of those marigolds at the strangest times. I remember them vividly now as I desperately pass away the time waiting for you, who will not come. I suppose that futile waiting was the sorrowful background music of our impoverished little community when I was young. The depression that gripped the nation was no new thing to us, for the black workers of rural Maryland had always been depressed. I don't know what it was that we were waiting for. Certainly not for the prosperity that was just around the corner, for those were white folks' words, which we never believed. Nor did we wait for hard work and thrift to pay off in shining success, as the American dream promised, for we knew better than that too. Perhaps we waited for a miracle, amorphous in concept, but necessary if one were to have the grit to rise before dawn each day and labor in the white man's vineyard until after dark, or to wander about in the September dust offering one sweat in return from some meager share of bread. But God was chary with miracles in those days, and so we waited and waited. We children, of course, were only vaguely aware of the extent of our poverty. Having no radios, few newspapers, and no magazines, we were somewhat unaware of the world outside our community. Nowadays, we would be called culturally deprived, and people would write books and hold conferences about us. In those days, everybody we knew was just as hungry and ill-clad as we were. Poverty was the cage in which we were all trapped, and our hatred of it was still the vague, undirected restlessness of the zoo-bred flamingo who knows that nature created him to fly free. As I think of those days, I feel most poignantly the tag end of summer, the bright, dry times when we began to have a sense of shortening days and the imminence of the cold. By the time I was 14, my brother Joey and I were the only children left at our house, the older ones having left home for early marriage or the lure of the city, and the two babies having been sent to relatives who might care for them better than we. Joey was 3 years younger than I, and a boy, and therefore vastly inferior. Each morning our mother and father trudged wearily down the dirt road and around the bend. She to her domestic job, he to his daily, unsuccessful quest for work. After our few chores around the tumble-down shanty, Joey and I were free to run wild in the sun with other children similarly situated. For the most part, those days are ill-defined in my memory, running together and combining like a fresh watercolor painting left out in the rain. I remember squatting in the road drawing a picture in the dust, a picture which Joey gleefully erased with one sweep of his dirty foot. I remember fishing for minnows in a muddy creek and watching sadly as they eluded my cupped hands, while Joey laughed uproariously. And I remember that year, a strange restlessness of body and of spirit, a feeling that something old and familiar was ending and something unknown and therefore terrifying was beginning. One day returns to me with special clarity for some reason, perhaps because it was the beginning of the experience that in some inexplicable way marked the end of innocence. I was loafing under the great oak tree in our yard, deep in some reverie which I had now forgotten, except that it involved some secret thoughts of one of the Harris boys across the yard. Joey and a bunch of kids were bored now with the old tires suspended from an oak limb, which had kept them entertained for a while. "Hey, Elizabeth," Joey yelled. He never talked when he could yell. "Hey, Elizabeth, let us go somewhere." I came reluctantly from my private world. "Where at, Joey?" The truth was that we were becoming tired of the formlessness of our summer days, the idleness whose prospect had seemed so beautiful during the busy days of spring, now had degenerated to almost desperate effort to fill up the empty midday hours. "Let's go see can we find some locusts on the hill," someone suggested. Joey was scornful. "Ain't no more locusts there. Y'all got 'em while they was still green." The argument that followed was brief and not really worth the effort. Hunting locust trees weren't fun anymore by now. "Tell you what," said Joey finally, his eyes sparkling. "Let's us go over to Miss Lottie's." The idea caught on at once, for annoying Miss Lottie was always fun. I was still child enough to scamper along with the group over to rickety fences and through bushes that tore our already raggedy clothes back to where Miss Lottie lived. I think now that we must have made a tragicomic spectacle. 5 or 6 kids of different ages, each of us clad in only one garment, the girls in faded dresses that were too long or too short, the boys in patchy pants, their sweaty brown chests gleaming in the hot sun. A little cloud of dust followed our thin legs and bare feet as we tramped over the barren land. When Miss Lottie's house came into view, we stopped, ostensibly to plan our strategy, but actually to reinforce our courage. Miss Lottie's house was the most ramshackle of all our ramshackle homes. The sun and rain had long since faded its rickety frame siding from white to sullen gray. The boards themselves seemed to remain upright, from not being nailed together, but rather from leaning together, like a house that a child might have constructed from cards. A brisk wind might have blown it down, and the fact that it was still standing implied a kind of enchantment that was stronger than the elements. There it stood, as far as I know is standing yet, a gray, rotting thing with no porch, no shutters, no steps, set on a cramped lot with no grass, not even any weeds, a monument to decay. In front of the house, in a squeaky rocking chair, sat Miss Lottie's son, John Burke, completing the impression of decay. John Burke was what was known as queer-headed. Black and ageless he sat, rocking day in and day out in a mindless stupor, lulled by the monotonous squeak-squawk of the chair. A battered hat atop his shaggy head shaded him from the sun. Usually John Burke was totally unaware of everything outside his quiet dream world. But if you disturbed him, if you intruded upon his fantasies, he would become enraged, strike out at you and curse at you in some strange enchanted language which only he could understand. We children made a game of thinking of ways to disturb John Burke and then to elude his violent retribution. But our real fun and our real fear lay in Miss Lottie herself. Miss Lottie seemed to be at least 100 years old. Her big frame still held traces of the tall, powerful woman she must have been in youth, although it was now bent and drawn. Her smooth skin was a dark reddish brown, and her face had Indian-like features, and the stern stoicism that one associates with Indian faces. Miss Lottie didn't like intruders, either, especially children. She never left her yard, and nobody ever visited her. We never knew how she managed those necessities which depend on human interaction, how she ate, for example, or even whether she ate. When we were tiny children, we thought Miss Lottie was a witch, and we made up tales that we half believed ourselves about her exploits. We were far too sophisticated now, of course, to believe the witch nonsense, but old fears have a way of clinging like cobwebs, and so when we sighted the tumble-down shack, we had to stop to reinforce our nerves. "Look, there she is," I whispered, forgetting that Miss Lottie could not possibly have heard me from that distance. "She's fooling with them crazy flowers." "Yeah, look at her." Miss Lottie's marigolds were perhaps the strangest part of the picture. Certainly they did not fit in with the crumbling decay of the rest of her yard. Beyond the dusty brown yard, in front of the sorry gray house, rose suddenly and shockingly a dazzling strip of bright blossoms, clumped together in enormous mounds, warm and passionate and sun golden. The old black witch woman worked on them all summer, every summer, down on her creaky knees, weeding and cultivating and arranging, while the house crumbled and John Burke rocked. For some perverse reason, we children hated those marigolds. They interfered with the perfect ugliness of the place. They were too beautiful. They said too much that we could not understand. They did not make sense. There was something in the vigor with which the old woman destroyed the weeds that intimidated us. It should have been a comical sight. The old woman with the man's hat on her cropped white head, leaning over the bright mounds, her big backside in the air. But it wasn't comical. It was something we could not name. We had to annoy her by whizzing a pebble into her flowers or by yelling a dirty word, then dancing away from her rage, reveling in our youth and mocking her age. Actually, I think it was the flowers we wanted to destroy, but nobody had the nerve to try it, not even Joey, who was usually fool enough to try anything. "Y'all get some stones," commanded Joey now, and was met with instant giggling obedience as everybody except me began to gather pebbles from the dusty ground. "Come on, Lizabeth." I just stood peering through the bushes, torn between wanting to join the fun and feeling a little bit silly. "You scared, Lizabeth?" I cursed and spat on the ground, my favorite gesture of phony bravado. "Y'all children get the stones. I'll show you how to use 'em." We crept to the edge of the bushes that bordered the narrow road in front of Miss Lottie's place. She worked placidly, kneeling over the flowers, her dark hand plunged into the golden mound. Suddenly, zing! An expertly aimed stone cut the head off one of the blossoms.